In the suffocating heat of an 1850s Georgia summer, the Hollingsworth estate looked like a monument to Southern prestige. The columns gleamed white against the red clay earth, and the fields stretched wide with what plantation owners proudly called white gold. In that era, a name like Hollingsworth carried weight across the state. It meant money, influence, and protection from scandal. At least, that was the illusion. Inside the nursery on the second floor, silence hung heavier than the humidity. The only sound was the faint rasp of a baby struggling to breathe between shallow sleeps. Little Thomas Hollingsworth, heir to a vast inheritance, lay in his cradle unaware that his life had already been calculated down to dollars and signatures. His mother, Lucinda Hollingsworth, stood near the window with a porcelain bowl in her hand. Her silk dress whispered across the floor as she stirred the infant's morning porridge. She paused, glanced toward the hallway to ensure no one was watching, then reached into her pocket. From within the folds of fabric, she withdrew a small blue glass vial with a chipped rim. The liquid inside shimmered faintly in the light. She poured a measured amount into the bowl and stirred until it disappeared into the oats. Foxglove extract, beautiful in a garden, deadly in concentration. Across the room, standing near the hearth with lowered eyes, was Euphemia, the wet nurse brought into the house because her milk had kept Thomas alive when Lucinda could not. To the Hollingsworth family, she was property. To Lucinda, she was something more useful, a future scapegoat. But Euphemia was not as unaware as they believed. For weeks, she had noticed the changes. The baby's lips had begun turning faintly blue. His pulse, once strong, now fluttered weakly beneath her fingertips at night. The air in the nursery often carried a bitter, metallic scent after Lucinda's visits. Euphemia knew plants. She knew the difference between medicine and murder, and that smell did not belong near a child. That morning, while cleaning soot from the hearth, her fingers had brushed against a loose brick. Behind it, hidden in shadow, she found the blue vial. The scent confirmed her fear before her mind could even deny it. Concentrated foxglove syrup, strong enough to slow a grown man's heart. She slipped the vial into the hidden pocket sewn inside her apron. Lucinda thought she was playing chess with a woman she considered invisible. She believed she could frame Euphemia, accuse her of witchcraft, and watch the magistrate deliver a sentence without ever touching the gallows herself. In Georgia, the word of a wealthy white mistress outweighed the life of a black nurse without question. But Lucinda had made one fatal mistake. She underestimated the woman in the corner. By sunset, Lucinda planned to bury her son and hang her caretaker. She believed the inheritance would flow back into her control and then into the desperate hands of her debt-ridden brother waiting at the estate gates. What she didn't know was this. The evidence of her crime was no longer behind that brick. It was beating quietly against Euphemia's hip. And as the baby's breathing grew weaker, the real battle inside the Hollingsworth house was only beginning. If you're drawn to the truths history tried to bury, make sure you subscribe to Canon of Darkness, because some family legacies weren't built on honor, they were built on blood. But here's the question that will decide everything. When the baby's heart finally falters, who will they blame? And who will still be standing when the lie collapses? By late afternoon, the air inside the Hollingsworth estate felt charged, as if a summer storm were gathering beneath the polished ceilings instead of over the Georgia pines. Lucinda understood timing better than most generals understood war. A crime without an audience was a risk. A crime performed in front of the right witnesses could become a tragedy instead of a murder. She entered the nursery again, this time without the quiet calculation of the morning. Her movements were sharper, louder, designed to be noticed. Euphemia stood near the cradle, gently rocking Thomas as his breathing struggled against his tiny chest. The child's skin had taken on a grayish hue that no mother could mistake for health, yet Lucinda did not rush to him with comfort. She looked first at Euphemia. Without warning, Lucinda crossed the room and struck her. The sound echoed against the nursery walls. It was not a slap born of emotion, but one crafted for effect. Almost immediately, Lucinda staggered backward as though she had been the one attacked. She called out for her husband with a tremor so convincing it could have earned applause on a theater stage in Savannah. She accused Euphemia of bringing curses from the quarters, of poisoning the room with strange herbs and dark superstitions. She claimed she had found markings near the hearth and that her son's decline began only after Euphemia took full control of his care. It was a careful strategy. Establish suspicion early, create a record of concern, shape the narrative before the body cooled. Sterling Hollingsworth stormed in within moments, his boots striking the floor with outrage fueled more by pride than by understanding. He did not kneel beside his son. He did not check the child's pulse. He saw his wife in apparent distress and the silent nurse standing nearby, and he chose the explanation that protected his household's dignity. Euphemia did not argue. She knew the danger of raising her voice in that room. Instead, she watched Lucinda's eyes. Beneath the performance of fragile motherhood, there was impatience, not grief, not fear, impatience. Downstairs, a carriage wheel crunched against gravel. Word had already been sent inviting Major Silas Thistlewood for dinner, a respected veteran known for valuing evidence over hysteria. Lucinda needed the child to worsen before the major left that estate. She needed a dramatic collapse. She needed a culprit ready to present. What she did not know was that the bottle she intended to retrieve for a final dose was no longer where she left it. As evening shadows stretched long across the plantation grounds, Lucinda returned to the hearth once more. She crouched beside the loose brick and reached into the soot-covered cavity. Her fingers found nothing. For the first time that day, her mask faltered. Because somewhere inside that house, the woman she meant to destroy was no longer merely surviving. She was preparing. And when the major stepped through those doors, the story Lucinda had rehearsed so carefully was about to collide with a piece of missing evidence she could not explain. The question is no longer whether the baby will survive the poison. The question is who will control the truth before the night is over. When Lucinda rose from the hearth with soot staining her fingertips and panic tightening her throat, she did not allow herself the luxury of hesitation. A missing vial could unravel everything she had constructed, but she understood that power often belonged to the one who moved first. If she could not recover the poison, she would bury the truth beneath something louder, something dramatic enough to command attention before suspicion had room to breathe. Within minutes, her voice carried through the halls with a new accusation. She claimed that a heavy gold brooch and a string of pearls had vanished from her dressing table. The theft, she insisted, must have happened that very afternoon. The timing was deliberate. Jewelry invited outrage. Theft justified force, and force would create the opportunity she needed to redirect scrutiny toward the most vulnerable person under that roof. Sterling responded exactly as she anticipated. His pride could not tolerate the idea that his household might be compromised. He ordered the overseer to search every cabin on the property without delay. Doors were thrown open, chests were overturned, personal belongings were scattered across dirt floors under the watch of armed men eager to prove their loyalty. The commotion rippled across the quarters like a warning siren. Euphemia remained in the nursery. The overseer returned before long, carrying a small burlap sack that looked harmless from a distance. He emptied it onto the polished nursery rug. Dried, grayish roots spilled across the floor. Hemlock. Poison strong enough to justify swift punishment without trial. Lucinda covered her mouth in theatrical horror. Her gaze shifted toward Euphemia with practiced sorrow, as though betrayal had broken her heart. Sterling's expression hardened instantly, not with confusion, but with fury sharpened by wounded pride. He did not question how such roots appeared under Euphemia's mattress. He did not consider coincidence. He saw confirmation of the story already seated in his mind. Without granting her a chance to speak, he seized her arm and dragged her from the nursery. The baby's faint whimper trailed behind them as she was forced down the hallway and toward the cooling cellar behind the kitchen, a stone chamber used to store meat away from the relentless Georgia heat. The heavy door slammed shut behind her, iron bolts sealing her in darkness thick with the scent of damp earth and salt. Upstairs, Lucinda now had privacy. The child was weaker than ever. The final dose no longer required subtlety. But she still did not have her vial. And while Sterling believed the cooling cellar swallowed Euphemia in darkness so complete that even the faint outline of her own hands disappeared once the door sealed shut. The air was heavy with the scent of cured meat, damp stone, and neglect. Above her, life continued in polished rooms lit by chandeliers, but below ground the estate revealed its true nature. It was a place where things were stored until needed, whether hams for winter or inconvenient people awaiting judgment. She allowed her breathing to steady before she moved. Panic would waste oxygen in precious minutes, and minutes were now measured against the slowing rhythm of an infant's heart. Thomas had already endured days of diluted poison. If Lucinda administered a stronger dose while Euphemia was confined, the child would not survive the night. She reached into the hidden seam of her apron and wrapped her fingers around the smooth curve of the blue glass vial. The cool surface felt like a pulse of its own. That bottle contained proof strong enough to fracture the Hollingsworth name, but proof meant nothing if she died before presenting it to someone who valued truth over convenience. Footsteps echoed faintly overhead, followed by the murmur of voices preparing to welcome Major Silas Thistlewood. Euphemia had observed him once before during a previous visit. He carried himself with the posture of a soldier who believed in order and logic. Lucinda needed the major present to legitimize her performance of grief. Euphemia needed him for a different reason entirely. A sudden sound interrupted her thoughts. Hooves shifting against grass near the rear of the estate. Then a low whistle drifting through the narrow vent high in the cellar wall. She moved quickly toward it, pressing her ear against the cold stone. "Euphemia," came a strained whisper. It was Zadok, the elderly stable hand whose back had bent with years of labor, but whose eyes missed very little. He had witnessed Julian Hollingsworth slipping through the property days earlier, arriving at odd hours with the urgency of a man drowning in debt. Zadok had also seen Lucinda retrieve something from his saddlebag beneath the cover of night.
"The baby ain't breathing right," Zadok murmured through the vent. "Mistress sent the master out to greet the major. She's alone with him now."
The final act was unfolding. Euphemia's voice remained calm, though urgency sharpened every word. She instructed Zadok not to seek Sterling but to find the major directly. She told him there was a secret hidden in the nursery hearth and that the evidence would not be found where Lucinda expected it. She understood the risk she was asking him to take. Speaking out of turn could cost him dearly, yet silence would cost a child his life. Zadok hesitated only briefly before disappearing into the night. Alone again, Euphemia examined the cellar door. The hinges were old and swollen from humidity. An iron hook used for hanging meat lay discarded in one corner. She grasped it and began working at the mortar near the hinge, each scrape echoing louder than it should have in the confined space. Upstairs, a mother prepared to complete her deception. Downstairs, the woman meant to hang was carving out her last chance. And as the major stepped into the grand foyer, unaware of the war unfolding within those walls, the balance of power shifted toward whoever reached him first. Because if Lucinda controlled the narrative before Euphemia escaped that cellar, no bottle and no truth would matter. But If the right ears heard the right whisper in time, the Hollingsworth legacy would not survive the night. Upstairs, the nursery felt unnaturally still, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath in anticipation of what Lucinda intended to finish. The fading sunlight filtered through lace curtains and painted the room in soft gold, a gentle contrast to the calculation tightening her expression. She stood over the cradle with the porcelain bowl in one hand and a silver spoon in the other, watching her son struggle against a heartbeat that no longer followed a steady rhythm. Thomas's tidy chest rose unevenly beneath his linen gown. A faint bluish tint clung stubbornly to his lips. The foxglove had already done most of its work, slowing the electrical impulses in his fragile heart. Lucinda knew that one stronger dose would push it past recovery. She convinced herself that the outcome was necessary, that her brother's mounting debts justified sacrifice, that wealth preserved dignity in a world where scandal devoured families whole. She framed it as survival rather than betrayal. Downstairs, Sterling greeted Major Silas Thistlewood with polished courtesy, unaware that the foundation of his lineage was crumbling a floor above him. The Major removed his gloves with deliberate calm, his reputation built on measured judgment rather than emotional outbursts. Lucinda had counted on that. She needed a respected witness to declare the death tragic and suspicious in equal measure. With Euphemia already locked away and false evidence planted, the path toward execution would appear seamless. Lucinda dipped the spoon into the porridge and brought it close to Thomas's mouth. His eyelids fluttered weakly. A faint cough escaped him, barely audible. She hesitated not because of doubt, but because she heard footsteps in the hallway. Sterling's voice drifted upward, guiding the Major toward the parlor. The timing had to be perfect. A dramatic collapse moments before medical examination would reinforce her narrative of sudden poisoning. She raised the spoon again, this time steady and resolved. What she did not see was Zadok entering through the side corridor below, his hat clutched tightly in weathered hands as he requested an urgent word with the Major. The old stable hand rarely spoke unless spoken to, which alone was enough to capture attention. The Major paused mid-conversation, noting the tension in the man's posture and the fear lining his voice. "There's something in that nursery hearth," Zadok said carefully. "Something you need to see before anything else happens." Above them, Lucinda pressed the spoon gently against Thomas's lips. In the cellar, mortar cracked under Euphemia's relentless strikes, and one hinge loosened with a quiet groan. The estate had become a stage where three movements were converging at once: a final dose, a warning delivered, and an escape forced open by bleeding hands. None of them knew precisely how close the others were to changing everything. The spoon hovered for only a second longer before Lucinda tilted it forward. And just as the thickened porridge touched the child's mouth, heavy footsteps began climbing the staircase toward the nursery door. The question is no longer whether the poison will work. The question is who will walk into that room first, and what they will see when they do. The nursery door opened just as Lucinda tilted the spoon forward, and the interruption arrived with the weight of authority she had not anticipated so soon. Sterling entered first, his expression strained by a confusion he did not yet understand. But behind him stood Major Silas Thistlewood, whose calm presence shifted the energy of the room without a single raised voice. He was not a man easily distracted by displays of emotion, and his gaze moved past Lucinda's trembling performance directly to the child in the cradle. Thomas's breathing was shallow and irregular, his tiny chest struggling against an invisible hand tightening around his heart. Lucinda withdrew the spoon with carefully measured panic, allowing it to clatter softly against the porcelain bowl as though shock had overtaken her. She moved toward Sterling, seeking his shoulder for support, while explaining that the baby had worsened suddenly and that she feared dark influences were at work. Her voice carried urgency, but it carried calculation as well. The Major stepped closer to the cradle without acknowledging her explanation. Years of military service had sharpened his instincts toward observation before judgment. He examined the child's pallor, the discoloration near his lips, and the slow pulse fluttering beneath fragile skin. He asked when the symptoms began and who had been responsible for feeding him. Lucinda answered swiftly, directing suspicion toward the cellar below, reminding Sterling of the hemlock roots discovered beneath Euphemia's mattress. Sterling nodded in agreement, eager for clarity that aligned with his pride. The narrative felt comfortable. A wicked nurse, a grieving mother, a dying heir. It was a story that preserved his household's honor. Yet the Major did not immediately accept it. Instead, he turned toward the hearth. Zadok's whisper lingered in his mind. The stable hand had spoken with the fear of a man risking more than punishment. He crouched near the fireplace and examined the loose brick whose edges bore fresh disturbance. Lucinda's composure tightened at the sight. She had not restored the hiding place after discovering the vial missing. The absence now became visible. "What was kept here?" the Major asked quietly. Lucinda responded that she had no knowledge of any hidden object, suggesting perhaps Euphemia practiced strange remedies in secret. Her tone remained steady, but a faint sheen of perspiration gathered along her temple. Sterling bristled at the implication that something had been concealed within his own home without his awareness. Before Lucinda could redirect the conversation, a sound echoed faintly from below the floorboards, wood splintering under pressure, a hinge loosening from swollen mortar. The Major lifted his head slightly, registering the disturbance. Sterling dismissed it as cellars settling in the evening heat, yet the Major's expression suggested he did not believe in convenient coincidences. Lucinda sensed the momentum slipping from her control. The spoon in her hand felt heavier now, not as a weapon, but as evidence of intent. Thomas let out a strained cry that pierced the tension, reminding them all that time was narrowing. In that room, truth hovered within reach. The final hinge tore loose with a splintering crack that echoed through the cellar like a gunshot. Euphemia forced her shoulder against the warped wooden door, ignoring the sting in her palms where skin had split against rusted iron. The swollen frame resisted for one suspended second before yielding under the weight of her desperation. Cool evening air rushed in, carrying with it the distant murmur of raised voices upstairs. She did not hesitate. Moving through the back corridor with controlled urgency, she wiped soot from her apron but left the blood on her fingers. That detail would matter. Blood suggested struggle. Struggle suggested injustice. Every step she took toward the staircase carried the knowledge that if she arrived too late, a child would die, and her own fate would be sealed before dawn. Upstairs, the nursery door stood partially open. She heard Lucinda's strained explanations and the measured tone of Major Thistlewood pressing for specifics. Sterling's voice cut through occasionally, defensive and impatient. Euphemia understood that her entrance had to disrupt more than the scene. It had to fracture the narrative. She stepped into the doorway without announcement. The room fell into immediate silence. Sterling's expression shifted from irritation to disbelief, then to fury as he realized she was no longer confined. Lucinda's composure faltered in a way it had not before, because the woman she intended to display as a criminal now stood upright and unbroken, soot still marking her sleeves. Before Sterling could speak, Euphemia addressed the Major directly. She did not plead, she did not accuse, she presented. From the hidden pocket inside her apron, she withdrew the small blue glass vial and held it forward so the fading light caught its chipped rim. The nursery no longer felt like a private chamber of domestic sorrow. It had become a courtroom without benches, where reputation and truth stood facing one another in the fading light. Major Thistlewood held the blue vial between his fingers with the same steady composure he had carried through battlefields years earlier. He examined the chipped rim, the residue clinging to the glass, and then shifted his attention to the porcelain bowl resting on the side table. Without asking permission, he dipped a gloved finger lightly into the porridge and brought it toward his nose. The bitterness was faint but present, masked beneath oats and milk. Sterling's breathing grew heavier with each passing second. He looked from the bowl to the vial and then to Lucinda, whose silence now carried more weight than any denial she could have crafted. She attempted to steady herself by invoking outrage, insisting that Euphemia must have stolen the bottle and orchestrated the scene to save her own life. Yet the argument lacked the conviction it once possessed, because too many moving parts no longer aligned in her favor. The Major did not respond immediately. Instead, he asked a question that cut through the performance entirely. "Where is your brother this evening, Mrs. Hollingsworth?" Lucinda's eyes flickered before she could control them. It was a small reaction, but it was enough. Zadok, who had remained near the hallway entrance, stepped forward and spoke carefully about the late-night visits he had witnessed over the past weeks. He described Julian's anxious demeanor and the exchange of money near the stables. He spoke of saddlebags carried in secrecy and hurried departures before dawn. Each detail added another stone to the growing structure of suspicion. The nursery no longer felt like a private chamber of domestic sorrow. It had become a courtroom without benches, where reputation and truth stood facing one another in the fading light. Major Thistlewood held the blue vial between his fingers with the same steady composure he had carried through battlefields years earlier. He examined the chipped rim, the residue clinging to the glass, and then shifted his attention to the porcelain bowl resting on the side table. Without asking permission, he dipped a gloved finger lightly into the porridge and brought it toward his nose. The bitterness was faint but present, masked beneath oats and milk. Sterling's breathing grew heavier with each passing second. He looked from the bowl to the vial and then to Lucinda, whose silence now carried more weight than any denial she could have crafted. She attempted to steady herself by invoking outrage, insisting that Euphemia must have stolen the bottle and orchestrated the scene to save her own life. Yet the argument lacked the conviction it once possessed, because too many moving parts no longer aligned in her favor. The Major did not respond immediately. Instead, he asked a question that cut through the performance entirely. "Where is your brother this evening, Mrs. Hollingsworth?" Lucinda's eyes flickered before she could control them. It was a small reaction, but it was enough. Zadok, who had remained near the hallway entrance, stepped forward and spoke carefully about the late-night visits he had witnessed over the past weeks. He described Julian's anxious demeanor and the exchange of money near the stables. He spoke of saddlebags carried in secrecy and hurried departures before dawn. Each detail added another stone to the growing structure of suspicion. Sterling's posture shifted from defensive to unsettled. He knew of his brother-in-law's gambling habits, but he had underestimated the depth of desperation. The inheritance reserved for Thomas had always been protected through legal trust, accessible only if the heir failed to reach adulthood. The implication hung heavily in the air. If the child died, control of the funds would revert elsewhere. Lucinda's composure finally fractured under the pressure of converging truths. Her voice rose in anger, then in panic, as she accused everyone in the room of conspiring against her. She claimed she had acted only to preserve the family from financial ruin. She insisted that scandal would destroy them faster than debt ever could. Yet, in defending her motives, she confirmed them. Thomas's breathing faltered again, pulling attention back to what mattered most. The Major immediately ordered fresh water and commanded that no further food or drink touch the child's lips. He instructed Sterling to summon a physician from town without delay and made it clear that no one was to leave the property until he completed his inquiry. The estate that had once projected unshakable authority now trembled under scrutiny. Lucinda stood motionless as the reality of consequence closed in. The rope she had imagined for Euphemia no longer felt distant. It felt possible. And while the physician had not yet arrived and the child's fate remained uncertain, one truth had already surfaced beyond denial. The Hollingsworth legacy was unraveling. But whether it would collapse quietly in legal disgrace or explode into public scandal depended on what the doctor would confirm next, and whether Thomas's heart would endure long enough to testify without words. The physician arrived just after midnight, his carriage wheels grinding against the gravel with a finality that no one inside the Hollingsworth estate could ignore. The nursery had transformed from a stage of accusation into a chamber of consequence. Thomas lay wrapped in fresh linen, his breathing fragile but present, suspended between survival and surrender. Major Thistlewood remained by the hearth, the blue vial resting on a side table beside the porcelain bowl, both objects now stripped of secrecy. The doctor worked with focused urgency, examining the child's pulse and the faint discoloration around his lips. After administering careful treatment to counteract the foxglove's effects, he confirmed what the major had already suspected. The symptoms were consistent with deliberate digitalis poisoning administered over time, not with accidental ingestion, and certainly not with roots discovered beneath a mattress. The dosage pattern suggested calculation rather than ignorance. Sterling listened as though each word removed a brick from the foundation beneath his feet. Pride had once insulated him from doubt, but evidence dismantled comfort with quiet precision. He turned slowly toward Lucinda, who no longer attempted to defend herself with theatrics. Her composure had drained away, replaced by a rigid stillness that resembled shock more than defiance. The inheritance she sought to secure had become the instrument of her exposure. Major Thistlewood did not allow emotion to dictate the next steps. He instructed that Lucinda be confined under guard until the magistrate could formally review the case. He ordered a search of correspondence related to Julian's debts and dispatched a rider to intercept him before he could flee the county. Zadok's testimony, the hidden vial, the planted hemlock, and the physician's medical assessment formed a chain too strong to dismiss. Thomas's breathing stabilized gradually as the night stretched toward dawn. The doctor's intervention had arrived just in time. Survival did not erase the attempt, but it ensured that the motive would never yield its intended reward. Without the death of the heir, the trust remained untouched. Without secrecy, the scandal could not be contained. By sunrise, word had begun spreading beyond the estate. A family once synonymous with power now faced public scrutiny. Sterling stood at the nursery window, staring across the fields that no longer felt secure beneath his name. Wealth could purchase influence, but it could not silence evidence witnessed by too many eyes. Euphemia remained near the cradle, not as property, but as protector. Her silence throughout the ordeal had preserved more than her own life. It had preserved truth long enough for it to be heard. Lucinda was escorted away before noon, not to a dramatic gallows, but toward legal proceedings that would dismantle her reputation piece by piece. The Hollingsworth legacy did not fall in a single blow. It eroded under exposure. If you stayed through this darkness, you understand something powerful. The most dangerous threat is not always the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it is the quiet witness who refuses to disappear. If stories that uncover buried truths matter to you,